on behalf of the Texas chapter of the American Planning Association, I'd like to welcome you all to the second in a series of dialogues between survivors of Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Harvey. This event is sponsored by the Texas chapter of the American Planning Association. Our previous dialogue was between residents of Houston and New York City. Today we'll be talking with folks from New Jersey, coastal New Jersey, and the coastal bend of Texas. This dialogue is part of a two-year effort on behalf of the Texas chapter of the American Planning Association to promote collaboration and mutual assistance to support recovery from natural disaster. The program is funded by a grant from the National APA Foundation, and as we prepare today's program, we've received ongoing support from the Austin-based staff of FEMA, from Texas A&M's Texas Target Communities, and our webinar is presented today with the help of Brian Geck from the North Central Texas Council of Governments. Today, our forum is focusing on the process of economic recovery from the perspective of coastal New Jersey and the coastal bend region of Texas. Although these two regions of the country are very distant from each other, the composition of their communities bears a great deal in common. The buildings and beaches were damaged in both, but both communities also are composed of many smaller and sometimes fragmented communities that are heavily dependent on the tourism economy for their success, for employment, and for the health of their communities. So what our speakers will talk about today is how both coastal New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy and the ROCKPORT Fulton region of Texas after Hurricane Harvey use the return of tourism dollars to their economies to help accelerate a resilient recovery. This panel today will address how they prioritize investments in each region and created marketing campaigns to attract visitors. We'll also compare the public and private economic tools and funding sources used for recovery in each state. As a case study, we'll explore how the Downtown Rockport Plan that's being prepared by the APA-funded Recovery Planning Assistance Team, also known as the RPAT, put these strategies into practice. Both Texas and New Jersey panelists today will address how community, regional, and state plans in place continue to provide a foundation for rebuilding a more resilient economy and returning residents to their homes. So I'd like to start today by introducing our panelists. We have three panelists joining us. My name is Kimberly Miller. I'll be the moderator for the day. Terry Brody from New Jersey will be our first panelist, followed by Diane Probst, and then by Carol Barrett. If I have control, thank you very much. I'm going to take this back to show you who each of us are and what we look like so you can visualize us as we speak today. And Terry Brody is a senior managing director based out of Ankara Consulting Group's New York office. But prior to joining Ankara, Terry helped establish and lead a central recovery office charged with coordinating the state of New Jersey's multi-billion-dollar disaster recovery effort after Hurricane Sandy, which happened on October 29, 2012. As the executive director of the Governor's Office of Recovery and Rebuilding, Terry worked closely with the federal government, state departments and agencies, local officials, and nonprofit, volunteer, and philanthropic organizations to design and execute a holistic recovery strategy for the state. In his current role at Ankara Consulting, Terry leads a team conducting complex internal investigations, providing compliance and ethics advisory services, and delivering independent monitoring and reporting services. Our second panelist is Diane Probst, who's the president and CEO of the five-star rated Rockport Fulton Chamber of Commerce. She's been at the helm of the chamber since 1990, and Hurricane Harvey is not her first rodeo with tropical storms. She holds a BBA in marketing from Texas A&M University College Station and is a graduate of the U.S. Chamber's Institute of Organizational Management. She's also a certified chamber executive of the American Chamber of Commerce Executives and a past chair of the Texas Chamber of Commerce Executives. Diane currently serves on the board of Texas Tourism Industry Association. She launched her first book titled Chamberology to assist chamber execs new to the field. Her second book titled When the Storm Comes will be available for purchase on Amazon at the end of the month. It gives 10 lessons learned when your community disaster comes along. Carol Barrett is the leader of the the Recovery Plan Assistance Team, as I mentioned before. Carol is known to many of us here in the state of Texas for her career with the City of Austin, the City of San Marcos, and she's also served in communities on both ends, all three coasts, actually, if we count Texas as a coastal state, starting in Annapolis, Maryland, and she is capping a long and distinguished career in California by bringing back her expertise in planning to looking at some of the economic development and recovery issues in downtown Rockport. And full disclosure, Carol was my introduction to the planning profession when she hired me right out of planning school from the University of Texas at Austin in 1996. So that's our distinguished round of panelists today, and I'd like to turn the conversation over to them. So we're going to begin with Terrence Brody, who will speak to us about his experience at the state of New Jersey with Sandy recovery. Terry.
Great. Kimberly, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, fantastic. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Kimberly, for that introduction. Before we dive in, I wanted to just commend the APA and the Texas chapter, as well as the other stakeholders that are participating today and in this seminar series for helping facilitate discussions like these. When we first began our long-term recovery efforts in New Jersey following Hurricane Sandy, we engaged in a number of what we call peer-to-peer discussions with jurisdictions who had been through it before. The list included Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, and Iowa. And it really helped enable us to get insights into what's worked well before, and probably more importantly, what hasn't worked well. And so we found that to be a really tremendously valuable experience, and I hope I can impart some of the lessons learned from New Jersey to some of these communities in Texas that are still rebuilding. Okay. So I thought we'd start by putting Sandy into context. When it first made landfall on October 29th, 2012, immediately prior it was a Category 1 hurricane, but it had been downgraded to what they call an extratropical cyclone. And so while the sustained winds may have died down a bit, it unleashed a devastating storm surge for consecutive high tides, with some of the surge measuring close to 9 feet across a lot of the state. That storm surge was pretty devastating. It swept homes and businesses off their foundations. It flooded critical infrastructure facilities, including things like wastewater treatment plants, electrical substations, gas distribution systems, among many others, and it displaced tens of thousands of families. Our initial damage estimates that we provided to Congress exceeded $30 billion. The slide that we have up on the screen highlights some of our damage assessment. We had 15,000 businesses that submitted an insurance claim for physical damage. I think it's really important to note that this is separate and apart from flood insurance claims, and since this was primarily a flooding event, I think this probably understates the extent of business damage pretty significantly. We had business interruption claims of close to $1.9 billion. More than 40,000 single-family homes and 15,000 rental units sustained severe damage. Also, as a caveat here, these stats only capture primary residences because federal funding wasn't available to folks with second homes, and we had quite a lot of those, particularly along some of the coastal communities. And we also had infrastructure needs of more than $17 billion, covering all the various infrastructure classes, some of which I mentioned before. So all of these figures come from New Jersey's action plan to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. The action plan, and as it was amended over time, described how we intended to spend approximately $4.2 billion in HUD Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funds, which we were awarded. We'll refer to these funds as CDBG as shorthand. I presume many of us on the call are somewhat familiar because it's a primary funding source for disaster recovery. It's not the only funding source, though. After a major disaster like Harvey, like Sandy, Congress may appropriate funding to various federal agencies to address recovery needs. Oftentimes, this will include HUD, FEMA, the Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Department of Transportation, Department of Interior, and et cetera, et cetera. But one of the reasons why I highlight the HUD funding is it's among the most flexible of the federal funding streams, which oftentimes the lack of flexibility hinders disaster recovery. So it's ideal for filling gaps that many of the other funding streams don't cover. Okay, so while today's discussion focuses a lot on the economic impacts of Harvey and Sandy, one thing that I think is really important to highlight, and I've tried to do it on this slide, is that all the impacted sectors are interrelated and interdependent. For example, it does no good if a business rebuilds and opens back up quickly before the housing stock is stabilized, the infrastructure is operational, and essential government services are restored. I mentioned before that we engaged in a number of peer-to-peer discussions at the outset of the long-term recovery process. We learned from those discussions that there are many different ways communities that have faced disaster on this scale have approached recovery. Some decided to build massive bureaucracies to manage every aspect of the recovery process. And this approach, I think, was good for accounting for some of the interdependencies noted on this slide. However, it often was slower to implement and less agile. Other jurisdictions divvied up their responsibilities among numerous agencies. If it's not done in a coordinated way, though, it's often difficult to see the complete picture and account for these interdependencies. So based on that, we decided to take somewhat of a hybrid approach. We built a small dedicated team within the governor's office that was responsible for coordinating all aspects of the recovery, working with the federal government, our state departments and agencies, our local communities, and the nonprofit community as well. We chaired working groups with our state cabinet officials to facilitate things like impacts analysis and to develop and implement programs to address the needs. These working groups are set up for a number of different sectors, including housing, economic recovery, health and human services. We also had a working group for each of the infrastructure classes as well. This enabled us to take a holistic view of the recovery, really realize these interdependencies, as well as potential synergies, and apply the limited federal and state funding in the most efficient and effective manner. So now let's get back to the focus on economic recovery. This next slide provides an overview of programs that either directly or in some cases indirectly benefited our businesses. In any disaster, once you get beyond insurance benefits, the first line of defense for businesses typically is the Small Business Administration disaster loan program. And they opened up shop pretty much immediately after Sandy hit, and they were very, very helpful. However, there were a number of challenges our businesses faced with the SBA loan program. First, there was a high denial rate because many of these companies were very small. They were over leveraged already before the storm, and they couldn't pass an underwriting review. So early on, I recall denial rates in the range of 75%. I know that number came down pretty significantly after some time, but definitely a lot of businesses weren't eligible for what I think is typically a more generous underwriting program than what you get in the private sector. Second, and more importantly, there was conflicting guidance as to whether taking an SBA loan would preclude businesses from later getting a grant under our CDBG program that I mentioned before, because the Stafford Act, which governs federal disaster recovery, has a duplication of benefits provision, which some of the federal agencies were interpreting as precluding taking on a grant after you've already taken a loan, at least for the same needs. So we won't get into the technicalities of duplication of benefits on this call. That could take a whole day on its own. But suffice to say that any business would prefer to get a grant over a loan for obvious reasons. We also had community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, which were active post-Sandy and offered attractive financing to support business recovery. And then we created some additional programs to supplement these programs, including 2 CDBG programs that directly supported businesses. The first was a $50,000 grant for businesses impacted by the storm. They had to be small businesses, but particularly along the coastline, it was primarily small businesses that suffered the greatest impacts and also had the least resources to be able to bounce back. The second was a low-cost loan of up to $5 million, which also enabled impacted businesses to not only rebuild, but expand their operations. And the thought process behind that was to catalyze economic activity in our most impacted communities. Notably, you see on the right, the funding was available for both working capital or construction activities. Businesses were encouraged to allocate the funding towards their working capital needs because money for construction activities often took a lot longer to get to the recipient due to things like environmental and historic preservation reviews and other requirements of federal funding that typically kick in on construction activities. So it just made it a lot more easier to administer. There were other programs, which we have a couple listed on this slide, that also assisted with accelerating the economic recovery, although businesses were not the direct recipients of some of these programs. First is FEMA Public Assistance, which I'm sure everybody's very familiar with. Also a first line of defense in a disaster recovery. It allowed us to do things like rebuild boardwalks that were completely destroyed in the storm and other public infrastructure that was necessary to be in place in a post-disaster scenario. We also had created the Neighborhood and Community Revitalization Program, which funded new streetscapes for downtown centers, which also helped catalyze that economic revitalization. And importantly, we made substantial investments in risk reduction measures. We applied both nature-based solutions and hard infrastructure to protect, in some cases, whole communities or even groups of communities. We did things like taking into account future sea level rise projections. And really the ultimate goal here was to try to mitigate the risk of flooding in these communities so that these businesses and these homes don't go through this repetitive flooding process time and time again. So we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about Sandy's impact on tourism, something that Kimberly mentioned at the outset. As you can see on the current slide, tourism accounted for $36.4 billion of New Jersey's GDP in 2014, or 6%, or 6.5% of the entire state's economy. So while the storm impacted majorly some of our urban centers, it had major impacts on our coastal communities where tourism is key to the local economy. Just to give you a little bit of context, the Jersey Shore is made up of 126 miles of coastline along the Atlantic Ocean, and much of this was sustained severe damage during Sandy. Unfortunately, many in the public were under the misperception that the entire Jersey Shore was not open for business after Sandy. That misperception was fueled by, among other things, the iconic picture you see on the slide of the Starjet roller coaster, which was swept into the ocean in Seaside Heights during Sandy. I think that in the news and in the media, there was obviously a focus on some of the more dramatic pictures of destruction. So, anticipating the 2013 tourism season, we knew we needed to combat that misperception. And what we did was we launched a $25 million tourism campaign funded in part with CDBG funds. There was some precedent for doing that from Katrina and something that we thought was important to do here. It was dubbed the Stronger Than the Storm campaign and included a multi-channel media and event campaign along with a cheesy theme song. So we had television and radio ads, social media, a website, and we sponsored events such as concerts and competitions in impacted communities throughout the summer of 2013. Some of the marketing even targeted Canada, where apparently many of our summer visitors come from. Fortunately, the campaign paid off and had its intended consequence. Some of the metrics that we use are depicted on the slide to determine success. Things like bed taxes, hotel occupancy rates that we got from destination marketing organizations, beach badge revenue, seasonal employment, and casino revenues, among others. And based on those metrics, the 2013 summer tourism season exceeded all of our expectations and was actually pretty close to being on par with past seasons, although some of the communities that really took the brunt of the storm took longer to recover. And I should note that that 2013 season was only approximately 6 or 7 months after the storm hit. The 2014 summer season was the strongest ever at that time, so that just gives you a sense of how quickly our tourism sector was able to bounce back. So just wanted to offer some final thoughts in closing before I turn it over to my co-panelists. First, as we already discussed, I firmly believe it's critical to take a holistic and comprehensive view of recovery so that limited resources can be applied in the most efficient and effective manner. And the best way to accomplish this is through strong leadership at the top. In our case, we had a governor who made disaster recovery his #1 priority of his second term of his governorship. And he was a staunch advocate for the state and really kept us on track. Second, resources are always limited and you have to make really hard decisions. We used to say that if money was unlimited, the job would be really easy, but it wasn't. So in order to ensure fairness in the distribution of limited resources, we ensured that all decisions were based on objective criteria so that our decisions could not credibly be challenged in the future. Third, communication is key. Survivors of a major disaster are under a tremendous amount of stress, and not knowing what is going on or where you can find help is a huge stressor. Therefore, constant communication is important, but not just through press releases. We set up resource centers and hosted events and workshops in the most impacted communities to get people the help where they need it most. It's also important to incorporate relevant stakeholders in the process, doing things like making the draft plans available for comment, engaging stakeholders with subject matter expertise on different approaches, and taking advantage of some of the nonprofits, volunteer organizations involved in disaster, and the philanthropic community, all which we partnered with, and they were a means to do more with less. Finally, disaster recovery is hard. You can never move as quickly as you'd like, either because the money hasn't been appropriated yet, or it takes a lot of time to set up the infrastructure and jump through many of the regulatory hurdles to make sure the money is spent in compliance and with all applicable laws and regulations, which is really key because if you don't, the federal government's going to come back in a couple of years and ask for their money back. So I hope some of these insights will be helpful for the communities still recovering from Hurricane Harvey today. And thank you again for the opportunity to participate.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Terry. I think we're going to proceed from panels to panelists during the conversation, but as people have questions, if you could start to kind of keep note of this because we will have time to ask questions at the end. So our next panelist is Diane Probst from ROCKPORT Fulton. And one thing that I'd like to draw as a contrast between the perspective that Terry presented which was at the state level, where he was looking at this problem and issue from the entire state. The perspective that Diane and Carol are both going to focus on is a much smaller micro function of how recovery happens. Diane works in Aransas County with the communities, particularly of Rockport and Fulton. And so as she gives her description, bear in mind what the contrast is between the daily activities that you have at the local level versus what's going on at the state level. So with Diane, with that description, I'd like to pass it on to you.
Very good. Thank you, Kimberly, for that introduction. And thank you, Terry. Great state perspective on everything. I think I bring a whole different aspect to the panel, and I drill it down to a very small community on the Texas coast. Let's see. I'm doing my arrow. There we go. The Rockport-Fulton area is in the coastal bend of Texas. We're about 30 miles north of Corpus Christi, and we're 3 hours roughly from Houston, Austin, San Antonio, and the Rio Grande Valley. So very easy to get to, very popular tourism destination. Small community, though. Aransas County is one of the smallest counties in terms of land in the state of Texas. Our land mass is 252 square miles. The population of Rockport is about 9,000, or it was 9,000. The population of Fulton about 1,500. The total county population, 24,000 people. So that gives you a perspective of Aransas County. We're mainly known for ecotourism. People come here for outdoor recreation. We are very limited in terms of staff, in terms of attractions, and small budgets. But we do have birding, kayaking history, and hike and bike trails. We have a national refuge here with the famous bird, the tallest bird, the whooping crane. Many people from all over the world to come to see that. We have Goose Island State Park. We have boat excursions, and we have a beautiful beach that just received the Best Beach Award for the state of Texas. We have the Texas Maritime Museum and Aquarium and Education Center, and then, of course, we're known for our sports fishing. We're also are known for our arts. We have a cultural arts district, an event center, and galleries, and art loops and walks and studios. So a very cultural, flavorful community. We have history. We have one of the famous schoolhouses. You have to come and see that. We have the Fulton Mansion, the History Center, and then a lot of interpretive signage prior to the storm. Of course, we're known for our fishing. There are piers and boats and marinas, a lot for a community of our size. And we seem to do well with event attractions and weekend activities. They seem to all be growing and flourishing. Now Harvey hits. It was August 25th of 2017, just 2 short years ago. The eye had its eye on Rockport Fulton. We haven't had a hurricane in this area since 1970, so we were very complacent. Our building codes, our standards, over the last 5 to 7 years had really improved. So anything prior to that, Harvey just really had its eye on it. And we'll go over just a little bit of that. We received approximately 25% of our county was completely destroyed in terms of structural value, 25%. And everything after that received some sort of damage. We had 140 mile per hour winds. And I know that seems really small after hearing the Bahamas with the 220 wind. That is unbelievable. The 140 mile per hour wind was sustained over a 4-hour period for us. The hurricane force winds was over a 13-hour period. So as Terry mentioned, storm surge was a problem on the Jersey shore. On our shore, it was wind. Every single structure in some form or fashion was receiving damage in some way. We had our workforce housing was completely destroyed. Our county airport lost 9 of its hangars. Our bridge to a major development with 800 homes was destroyed. It's down to 1 lane at this point. Our school district lost 500 students. Navigation district had to completely revamp all of the marinas, harbors, and beach areas. We lost many of our recreation areas in terms of parks for the kids to play ball and in terms of activities for our local folks had pretty much been destroyed. In terms of debris, we had almost as much as the Houston area in terms of debris. Our county is known for live oak trees, and that coupled with the structural damage really puts it in perspective as to what we lost. So from the storm, we've learned about 4 lessons learned. Now, I can talk all day about what we've learned with Hurricane Harvey, but we wanted to focus just on the economy. So the lesson number 1, how we jump-started our economy here and the obstacles that we faced. We'll go over several campaigns there. Then we'll flow right into establishing our long-term recovery team and how that was an important aspect of the whole recovery effort, and that's still in play today. And then we'll talk a little bit about communication and how a small county without communication was able to communicate. And then number 4, the last one, we'll talk a little bit about how we were able to pull off small business grants. So lesson number 1, we jump-started the economy in terms of an open-for-business live site. So I was off-site at a town about 3 hours away and able to open a live Google document. Believe it or not, you resort to whatever you can at the moment. And we were able to announce that 25 businesses were open. Because in terms of our chamber, our sole role and activity was to build back the economy. So you're walking a fine line there. Are you ready to say you're open for business? Well, we did. And when we did that, it was pretty aggressive, and we were able to establish ourselves or position ourselves for people to find out information about what was open and how they could help. So with that establishment and building that spreadsheet, people started emailing us, texting us, calling us, asking to be put on that list. They were open. So it gave us a great way to kind of be a read for the EOC team, our Emergency Operations Center team, as to how many businesses were open. We were able to, at that point, leverage what we do best in terms of tourism and say, okay, come and volunteer, but also be a tourist. So voluntourism took a really important part. We had a reception center as the people arrived, and that reception center would keep track of, on sticky notes, believe it or not, on what was available for them to do. So if you're a group of 4, say a family of 4, they could give you exact information of where to go and what to do. And that proceeded to happen over the next 2 or 3 months, which was our crisis period. And we knew at some point we had to jumpstart tourism. So I received a call from a very generous gentleman out of Austin, Texas, called Jeff Hunt, and he was able to kind of assist us as we worked through a comeback campaign. And we did the campaign that focused on Find Yourself in Rockport Fulton. We were able to use the song Back to Being Me, Back to Being Rockport Fulton by George Strait. And we were able to use his voice in our TV and radio commercials and press releases and announcements. He has a home here, or had a home here, and we had asked him years and years and years to use anything from him, but it took a hurricane to get his attention, and he allowed us to do that. So within a matter of weeks, he went down to a local radio station, I believe in San Antonio, and was able to do that recording for us. That was tremendous, not only for to boosting the economy, but to lift the spirits of the people here and encourage them, okay, we can stay in business. We can do this. So by that following March, we had well over 60% of our businesses open, functioning, and running for a small county out of 1,100 total businesses. So the campaign, he just focused and he just said words like, you know, when Hurricane Harvey devastates the area, the people of Rockport and Fulton are doing okay, and they want you to come back. And I don't know if we can play that commercial now. Do I hit the link, or are you going to play it? Or
just advance the slide. I'll play it.
Okay.
I'm back to see you. Hello, this is George Strait. When I have a day off, I like to be outside in this beautiful state of ours. Not just anywhere, though. I make my way to Rockport, Fulton. Everyone is so friendly. The bay is beautiful and perfect for fishing. It's where I go to get away. I hope you'll discover it for yourself and find yourself in Rockport, Texas soon.
So we were very fortunate to have George Strait do that for us. That campaign, we were able to go to Rebuild Texas, and this was a fund set up by the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation for to help communities as they recover from the disaster. We approached them for $250,000, and they were able to give that to us, and then we were able to leverage that and get other funds. So a very small in terms of dollars campaign, but was far-reaching for us by using his voice. Can't imagine how important that was for us. That was tremendous. And then under events, we used our events as people magnets, a way for people to come into our community and help. Just 6 weeks after the storm, we have a festival called Seafair, and we received a lot of pushback from doing this event so soon after the storm. But what it did is it positioned the chamber to set the stage. We are strong, we are resilient, we're going to be okay, and we set the stage for others. So other nonprofit organizations followed suit with their events. We limped along. They weren't the best, but it brought a sense of normalcy back to the community very quickly. The event itself, we could not offer a single hotel room to anyone. The hotels were all destroyed or under a remodeling. So we had to say, drive in for the day and leave at 10. And it worked. People came. We have established an economic development plan. So early on, the IEDC called us and said, how can we help you? We said, come and do a community input session. Do a session where you're getting input from the people, because we knew they needed to air, they needed to discuss. This has it's been an extremely long time before we'd had a hurricane before. So a lot of input there. So in those sessions, we developed a short-term and long-term implementation plan, and that allowed us to put on paper the direction we were going for the short term and then for the long term. So it really helped out. And then we established the long-term recovery team. This was about 6 weeks after the storm. What we discovered, our county judge received a call from a foundation that said, hey, we love your community. It's so special to us. We want to help. How can we help? He said, send me someone. Send me people. Send me people to help. And so they were able to send us 2 former city managers, and they split their duties in half, and they also established a housing person, a reception, a public information officer, a government relations person, and a project manager. And they're still in a team today. What it did is it was refreshing for us as staff. They took care of things we didn't have to take care of. They were a fresh voice. They could take on speaking engagements. They could take on things that we were basically exhausted to do. And then by them reaching out and locating, what are the funds available? Where can I find this? How do I do this? They were a great help in that area. And then lesson learned number 3 is develop a plan for communication to the public. Communicate clearly. we had a massive social media problem. We would be communicating out to the public exactly what was going on, and it was being perceived in a negative way. We had to find out ways to combat that, and we established a one voice, one message system from our mayor. He sent out a letter each evening, and we all followed suit. Where whatever entity was involved, we followed suit with that letter. And that was tremendous in getting the word out initially. And then we were able then to collect ourselves and follow through. There's so many better ways to communicate, even in small communities, that we've learned now 2 years later. We had transparency issues that we didn't even, they weren't warranted. You couldn't explain yourself enough because people were so angry at their keyboards and just so ready to blast. Tremendous amount of negativity. It was just hurtful. And so communication plan is crucial. We are developing our plan now. It's going to involve kiosks on all sections of our community. And the kiosks hopefully are going to be solar paneled. And we're going to actually walk a flyer to those kiosks early on, giving them descriptions. And then from there on, communicate to these kiosks information. So it's not rocket science. It's just a strong communication method in small communities where everybody is not operating with all sorts of communication. And then last lesson is number 4, where we were able to do small business support grants. And like Terry said, there are grants available through the state, through the federal government. There are programs that are pop up, but they're difficult. There's a lot of paperwork. We noticed that we could join together as a region, coordinate an event, and get foundations to match that event fundraiser and offer out grants. And we were able to do 4 rounds of grants. And just for our community alone, we were able to distribute 150 grants to local businesses. And to do those presentations, we had them all come into one particular location and hand them a check. Now, they had to fill out an application process and say where that money was going to go. It was a lot of times repairing an awning that was excluded in their particular insurance policy, or small items, but we were able to give them a little boost in the way of a grant. And now we're working on a forgivable loan program. And so this was crucial to the economy. It wasn't that hard to do looking back, I say that, but it was something that was met with such a positive thing. So the chamber had to find out its role in the crisis. Now, many of you may not have strong chambers. You may have other organizations that will rise to the top, but it takes a leader. We noticed early on that philanthropy was an area we were good at. And so we started collecting unsolicited funds by a simple GoFundMe link. And then we were able to realize that, and by the way, in that particular account had $2,000 initially, and in 60 days it grew to $1.4 million. And that is larger than our chamber organization's budget. So we were able to do something really beneficial to the community. Although we received a lot of flack and negative for that, we were able to turn that back into housing later on in the community. And then we were a major information source. It was so difficult to communicate that we had to provide accurate information. And then we've talked a lot about the economy, the events, and the comeback campaign, and small business and our formation of our EDC. We did not have an economic development corporation prior to the storm. We just are not funded in that area. We're funded in tourism. So what's coming? What's rising? Well, we're getting a new ROCKPORT Arts Center, Performing Arts Conference Center. That's an $8.5 million project in the downtown area. We're developing our cultural arts district. We're getting a city center, which is going to be a combination rebuilt courthouse city hall project. We're getting a boardwalk. Fulton Harbor Convention Center, we're rebuilding that Keel Labor Bridge we talked about. Those 7 hangars are getting rebuilt. We're getting a new gym that Ellen DeGeneres helped provide, and we're getting new ball fields that foundations were able to provide. And just south of us, near the Port of Corpus Christi, we have $50 billion in projects and investments from an industrial perspective that are happening down south of us. So where do we go from here? We wanted to list out what the public sector for us we felt were key areas, and we just feel that adhering to code enforcement is just of a major importance, including items on their insurance policies now that they inadvertently left off in their renewing process, and then to don't be complacent next time. Use the word fortified in everything that they do and get quality storm shredders so that you can push a button and leave. Our community is forever changed. It's changed for the good, as we've noticed in the Rockport Fulton Rising, and for the bad. In many areas, a lot of people have lost major things. But it is what it is, and we just have to move on. So with that, I thank you, and I'd love to hear our next panelist.
Terrific. Diane, thank you so much. I think that the way that your work and Terry's work plays into each other is it's really fascinating to see how many commonalities there are between Texas and New Jersey, even at different scales. And so with that, to wrap things up, I wanted to bring on Carol Barrett, who's been working with assistance, financial assistance from the Community Planning Assistance Team program. This was a recovery planning assistance team, I believe, that was created with funding from the APA Foundation. Carol, along with the APA, helped build a team that's been working to support some of the efforts that Diane's just been describing, and she'll talk about those efforts and some of the points and lessons that she's learned based on her experience and her team's experience with planning throughout the country. So Carol, take it away.
I've been fascinated listening to Terry and Diane. I think their comments have been very helpful. And of course, I'm going to be talking about a very different scale of activity. The Rockport Recovery Planning Assistance Team project, which is modeled on APA CPAT program, is one of the APA Foundation's 2018 Disaster Recovery Grant recipients. The project is supported by the Pisces Foundation through a grant awarded to the APA Foundation that focuses on building back better with green infrastructure after disasters. Am I supposed to be doing something on my end to get my presentation up, or are the presentation fairies doing it? Thank you, fairies. I'm going to be discussing only a small slice of the pie of the work done by the extraordinary team that was engaged in assisting the city of Rockport. And our focus was on Austin Street, which is a commercial corridor within the city's Heritage District. And our task was to look at what had been accomplished in the last 2 years, the major projects on the horizon that Diane listed, and discuss what the city needed to do to better capitalize on those opportunities. Just a minute or two on how big was Harvey. Our hurricane's bigger than your hurricane, covered 50,000 square miles. A third of the state's population was impacted. More than 90 people died, and the largest rainfall event ever recorded in the U.S. Was tied to this hurricane. More than 60 inches of water was dumped on some places. In Rockport, the South Texas Economic Development Center, estimated Rockport suffered damages in excess of $445 million. This next item is really significant. All of the low-income housing complexes within Rockport were heavily damaged, and Aransas County cleaned up over 2 million cubic yards of debris, which is about 10% of all the debris that had to be cleaned up in the state of Texas. So in terms of adapting to post-Harvey conditions, one of the big challenges that the city has is they have ordinances that were already in place that covered the Austin Street Corridor and the Heritage District, but they are complicated form-based code ordinances, and they don't have planners, trained planners on the staff. They had difficulty with the ordinances before the hurricane and were not prepared for the kinds of challenges that emerged as people were attempting to rebuild. Diane talked about the wonderful job that was done getting tourists back, but some tourists had unreasonable expectations for just how ready Rockport was. In terms of infrastructure issues, the outstanding issues that we still see is the failure of the stormwater conveyance system. It's not working now in the downtown, and it's only getting worse absent green infrastructure. This slide shows some of the transportation issues. This is the roadway adjacent to the bay, and when they have seasonal high tides, that tidal water washes over the local streets. I want to focus briefly on one of the infrastructure items that the other speakers alluded to briefly, and that is the civic infrastructure, the glue that holds the community together, the people who make things happen. Recovery fatigue sets in, and that glue, that civic infrastructure weakens, and we found that as part of our work. Rockport's doing a good job of rebuilding, but they've got some fairly restrictive zoning that if they don't work on it, over time, affordable housing is going to be replaced with expensive beach housing. They don't have requirements for green infrastructure, which is problematic. A lot of our recommendations were to deal with the regular rain-related tidal flooding in their downtown. And for reasons not interesting to this phone call, they got a ton of room on their public streets where they could implement these kind of recommendations that those of you who work on stormwater management issues and non-point source pollution are already very familiar with. So stepping back some, getting a comparison of New Jersey and Texas, state assistance is focused on priorities for implementation related to statewide economic impact, money that the legislature originally appropriated so that the communities could do long-range planning has been shifted to project work, and there is not a state-supported infrastructure for planning. This is the boundary of the Coastal Bend Association of Governments. You can see Aransas County in the northeast corner, 2 people associated with disaster recovery, and that's all disasters for this entire area. Rockport had done a really good job and had adopted a 1-foot freeboard requirement before the storm came in. But in their heritage overlay ordinance, they have conflicting procedures for elevation of structures, and that's problematic for building owners, and we've identified the need to resolve those. But ultimately, we think Austin Street realistically is in the center of the drainage bowl, and commercial activity over time needs to be moved elsewhere in the community. Rockport is not geared up right now to do a lot of resiliency thinking for supporting its downtown area. This photograph of downtown Annapolis shows you municipal resiliency with signs that prevent cars from driving through the tidal flooding. They don't have that in Rockport, so the local businesses not only are dealing with the tidal flooding when there's rain, but then it's exacerbated by all the cars driving through the Austin Street area. All the science that's available talks about the future of coastal areas becoming floodier. So what are the lessons that we can take away? Long-range plans need to be in place. They had a lot of good plans already in place in Rockport that fed into the recovery plan, but not everything was in place that needed to be there. They don't have a commitment to green infrastructure in an ordinance form. So even today, if you came and proposed a project on vacant land in their historic commercial corridor, you'd be allowed to pave most of the property. And the absence of a consistent regulatory framework to minimize stormwater impacts is hurting Rockport all over the city, not just in the downtown. I think people in communities increasingly understand flooding. They just don't understand that it costs some money to do things differently to avoid the $445 million bills that accrue at the end of these kinds of hurricane events. One of the challenges that Diane talked about that I think is really important is in a tourism-based economy, when you get the tourists back, somehow you want to create not only that we're open for business, but that you are part of the recovery process. You are on the recovery team. And so if there aren't hotel rooms or service isn't perfect in a restaurant, that's okay. By accepting all of those constraints, you are supporting the recovery process. And the final item I want to mention is one that we really zeroed in on. There is an absence right now among some people in Rockport of the technique of compassionate communication. When we were looking at downtown and the role that specialized retail plays in ecotourism, and there is a significant role that it plays, and it's also tied to supporting the winter Texans, and there are a lot of them in Rockport. People are talking at one another. They've stopped listening to one another, and they are resorting to some degree of finger pointing. So the kinds of resources that APA was able to bring to bear were particularly helpful in terms of helping people to think about, okay, let's take a deep breath. Let's think about what we want to work on next. And if I can emphasize anything, I would say that the role of foundations, and in the case of the APA planning team, the Pisces Foundation, but the role of foundations in supporting what happened in Rockport was just enormous. And the state was lucky that its culture doesn't involve having big government come in and solve your problem, but it does involve a lot of people saying, I want to step up and I want to figure out how I can be helpful. The thing that everybody who's been through a major hurricane knows is that hurricanes do not just mark the land, they mark the people in terms of before and after and how the world has changed for them. And so supporting communities through that emotional as well as physical recovery is incredibly important. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you, Diane, and thank you, Terry, for giving us your perspective from 3 different levels of recovery, from the 7 years out now, I believe, in New Jersey, to the immediate work that you've done for one specific area of ROCKPORT, Carol. It's been really illuminating to hear each perspective on how recovery happens. I wanted to start off by asking a question to you all, and I want to ask Brian, who's helping us run the technology behind this. Can people type in questions? People who are listening, can they type in some questions for the panelists as I'm starting to, ask them the first ones to kickstart our conversation?
Yes, if people could type their questions into either the chat box or the Q&A box, as long as you set it to send to everyone, then we can all read the questions and go through them.
Okay, terrific. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to do, and I'm going to pose this to all the panelists. All of you talked some about the importance of bringing the tourism economy back and quickly. You also talked about the extent of damage to your coastal communities. Could you describe some of the challenges to bringing the tourism workforce back home and some of the lessons that you learned from your struggles with that? Maybe, Terry, if you want to go first. You all talked about bringing the tourism economy back up within a year. If you could talk about how the supply of housing and the workforce was able to fill the need created by the reopening of the tourist economy.
And then, what happened after Hurricane Katrina, particularly in Louisiana, there was mass migration out of Louisiana, which really impacted the local economy and the tax base and the ability to bounce back. So that was something that was definitely front of mind for us, one of the lessons learned that was imparted on us from Louisiana. So to avoid that after Sandy, we knew we had to develop a comprehensive housing strategy that addressed short-term, mid-term, and long-term housing needs. And to make sure that, we started out with folks in shelters, and then they transitioned to hotels and motels. And then, we basically let folks know where vacancies were in apartment buildings nearby in their communities, because we thought it was so important that that folks stay in their communities or as close to their communities to have some sense of normalcy and to keep that, labor workforce, proximate to where they're working, to where their jobs are. And we also actually provided some incentives, particularly to homeowners, financial incentives, whereby if they committed to staying in their community for 3 years, they were entitled to a grant, a dollar grant, on top of the home reconstruction grants that we were giving out. So, those were some of the strategies that we used to make sure that, once the businesses came back, that there were people to actually, work in that tourism economy and keep things going.
Diane, you seem to have faced a similar need. If you could talk about how people were commuting to ROCKPORT after the storm as well, and maybe give a little perspective for anyone who's not familiar with ROCKPORT about the geography of your community.
Sure. Of course, we lost, every bit of our housing. So people had to drive into our community. So we had commuter buses pick people up in the surrounding communities and bus people over here. That worked somewhat, but mostly we started a Build Your Resume at the Beach program, where we started another live Google sheet where we listed employers providing opportunities. So we just kind of went around Workforce. Workforce Solutions is our state program here. And we just developed our own and started promoting what each employer was needing. And then we would push that list out and get them assistance, to push it out to nearby major metropolitan areas, and get them phone calls and use online web information sources, and that worked. We leveraged our beautiful beach to get them to come here and make good wages at the restaurants here during the summer months. Now, for the winter months, it's going to be more difficult as we go into this second year of recovery.
I think that the Build Your Resume at the Beach program, you were actually attracting people from other communities to move to the Rockport Fulton area.
Just drive in.
Drive in.
Because our housing stock is so expensive. They're not able to move here, and the apartment complexes are not rebuilt yet.
Excellent. I have a question from the audience. The question is, there appears to be a great disparity in the role of state recovery between New Jersey and Texas. Can the panelists comment on that?
Sure, I'll kick off. This is Terry. Yeah, we definitely had a very state-centric approach to our recovery. That was partly because New Jersey was designated the grantee under the HUD grants as well as under the FEMA grants. But it's also because the practical reality is a lot of the communities that were majorly impacted by Sandy were very small towns. They had part-time staff, tiny budgets with, absolutely no surpluses to deal with some of these storm-related expenses, and didn't really have the expertise or bandwidth, to carry out the recovery on their own. And so they relied very heavily on the state for not only for money, but also for technical assistance. Everything from dealing with construction code and zoning issues, to figuring out how do they finance some of their short-term recovery needs. And so we, at the state level, largely administered the programs, which also helped ensure consistency throughout the program and also compliance with the complex web of federal laws and regulations, which I mentioned before. If you fail to comply with those, the federal government's going to come back a couple of years later and say, write a check for X million or X tens of millions of dollars. And we knew that was something that we couldn't afford.
And as far as the state of Texas, that was the state of Texas immediately went to a rebuild Texas mode. The governor appointed an awesome task force to go into these communities and have them establish their immediate needs. But it is upon the community itself to drive it. What are their needs? Step up. What do you need? And that's where we had to utilize local staff along with this long-term recovery team to tell the state what we needed. In terms of the debris, I remember around October we were still covered with piles and piles of debris. And the governor and the state Texas team came into our community and established ways for TxDOT, our Department of Transportation, to come in with dump trucks. And literally dump truck by dump truck helped get that off of the roadways. And just incredible months of work of incinerators literally cremating or burning the debris. And just without the state stepping in and doing that, you're tremendously helpless. But our state really has a strong program. And since then, it's formed its own department with the disaster recovery called TDEM, Texas Department of Emergency Management.
Carol, I'm not sure if you've worked in New Jersey, but I don't know if you'd like to provide an outside perspective from the different places you've worked as a planner, too, about the roles between state and local governments.
Well, I think Diane's discussion is really helpful. The point at which the storm hit, Texas had $10 billion in its rainy day fund from oil and gas revenue leases, and was able to make money available. So they did a great job of coming in and helping to get everybody back to a certain degree of normal. But what's not available for the really long term is the more fine-grained things that, yeah, the streets are open and the stores are open and somebody's building something, but there's not an ability to help a place like ROCKPORT, the city of ROCKPORT on its own, figure out how to do tax reinvestment and zone application. And that's technical assistance, and there may be a day when emergency management is set up to do that. But I think they've got it titled the right thing. They're there for the emergency and to help you get a leg up, but not for the long term. You are going to have to figure out the really long-term stuff on your own. And I can't criticize Texas for being that way, because if you don't like that, I can name you half a dozen states where government will be happy to engage and provide a lot of resources, but that's not the philosophy that the state of Texas employs, and people who come here like it because of the lack of detailed restrictions, assistance from the state level. So it's really surprising 2 years out that for some of the kinds of economic development strategies that Diane talked about, is that the Chamber of Commerce is figuring this out, how to do it. The city of ROCKPORT is standing, it's supportive and it's interested, but it's not looking at any more sophisticated economic development tools because it's one of those small, understaffed cities, and this stuff just strikes them as being too complicated. Does it mean in the very long run that the recovery 7 years out in Texas will be substantially behind New Jersey? I don't know. It could be that it will resolve itself along the way. But Texas is really good at jumping in and helping, but not in terms of long-term support for some of the more fine-grained work that needs to be done to improve the availability of housing and other economic development opportunities.
Good. Thank you for providing that perspective that unites the two, Carol. Another question that I have for you all is how the regional relationships that you have played a role in your recovery in both locations as well. Regional governments, regional relationships with other communities, how did that play part of your recovery?
Jerry, do you want to go first, or I can if you?
Yeah, feel free. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Regionally, communities south of us had no damage or very little damage, so they came to support and to help. So by the strength of their organizations, we were able to leverage and to do things that were extraordinary. Prior to the storm, not much contact. Don't know why. It just didn't happen. It was just not done. After the storm, we have worked very closely together, not only in terms of the economy, but in terms of shared projects amongst other chamber-type activities.
This is Carol. Another regional player was incredibly important, I think, in the coastal bend was Texas A&M. Long-term commitment through the target communities and the Texas Sea Grant program. They have sent a number of student classes down to assist with planning for the county and the city. And this is not unusual for Texas A&M. They had a long-term Katrina effort after that storm, but it's really been a remarkable regional partnership and something that goes way beyond what you think an academic institution might do to support a place like Aransas County and Rockport Fulton.
Kimberly, this is Terry. The only thing I'd add, because I think we talked a lot about how in New Jersey it was really a state-led initiative. So, by definition, I think the regional government had a very big role. But we went even a little bit broader than that and worked very closely with the state of New York and the city of New York. We had some shared assets which are owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which was a bi-state agency that owns many of the bridges and tunnels between northern New Jersey and New York City, as well as some transit assets and airports. So we were kind of in it together to figure out how best to approach recovery for those assets, which were really critical to the metropolitan economy. And we also looked more broadly, working with the Army Corps of Engineers, as to exploring whether there were larger infrastructure-based projects that we could undertake to reduce the risk of flooding in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area, looking at things like seawalls and really ambitious projects. And then also looking at some more regional projects as well. So there definitely was some regional collaboration, but I think there were a lot on both states' plates to focus on. So there was some of that, but it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was a big part of the recovery.
There was one program, Rebuild by Design, that might be part of what you're referencing. Is that something that you worked with directly?
Yes,
and could you describe that?
Sure. That's a little bit different. That was actually a program that Secretary Donovan at HUD had developed, and essentially it was a competition among. Essentially, they asked for engineering firms and architecture firms and others to submit ideas and concepts for how they would approach some of the flooding issues in the Sandy impacted communities. And so it was a very sort of open process. And then once those submissions were made, HUD whittled them down to a number of different projects. And then we worked with the project teams to explore the feasibility of those projects. And, eventually we got to the approval stage and environmental reviews and things like that. So there are two projects in particular in New Jersey that are proceeding. One is to provide some additional protection to the city of Hoboken, Weehawken, and Jersey City in Hudson County, New Jersey, which is pretty much right across the river from New York City, but to try to provide a regional approach to risk reduction. And so that's pretty far along in terms of the EIS process and the NEPA process. And then there's another project that received funding in the Meadowlands region, which is also in northern Jersey, spanning Bergen County and Hudson County, looking for ways to reduce some of the fluvial flooding that region experienced on the Hackensack River after Sandy. And again, that's going to be a combination of nature-based solutions and some stormwater planning and designing and things like that. So So that was definitely a very interesting program, because it was bringing a lot of attention, a lot of, thought leaders to really look at, maybe sort of an independent look at some of our more significant flooding issues. And so it's really sort of an innovative process. I will tell you that it in some respects, put the state in a difficult position because, essentially a lot of the money that would have came to us from a discretionary standpoint to use for projects was reallocated to this program. And, we had a lot of counties and municipalities asking, why is Bergen County or Hudson County getting all this money when we're not? And we have just as bad, if not worse, flooding issues. So, it wasn't without its complications for us, but I think at the end of the day, it was a very big success, and those projects should be close to the construction phase right now.
Great, thanks. Interesting to see more about that. That's a whole other conference right there.
Exactly.
We have a question about the types of pre-disaster recovery plans that New Jersey and Rockport had in place before their respective incidents and how well they addressed economic recovery. There's another part to that question. What changes have you made based on what you learned? And then there are several more parts to the question. So, Jonathan, thanks for your question, but we may limit that to maybe one or two pieces. Who would like to start that off?
Sure. With me being in the position nearly 30 years, every conference I attended, just lots of training in a crisis plan, emergency plan. We had a full economic recovery plan in terms of a advertising campaign. We had press releases written. We had contacts that need to be made, and so on. But to be honest with you, I didn't run down to the office and grab the plan and work the plan. We worked it by the feel of the people. We knew that plan in our mind, and we were able to pull it off. But you have to. It's living and breathing your plan. Use your experience and what you know, and follow the guidelines of the community, to me. And then in terms of pre-planning, we had mock scenarios. We have a coastal event hurricane conference where we do strategic planning and recovery efforts. We have just on and on and on how much we've prepared. We do seminars as far as our businesses. Many of our businesses are certified in ready.gov, and it just it's the plans are there, but they're I don't know that. I think we're better off because of the plans. I just don't know the reaction right now. I guess it's too fresh to know if the plans all really worked for us.
I can speak a little bit to New Jersey. I mean, obviously, we had a FEMA-approved state hazard mitigation plan when Sandy hit, and we actually had to redo our plan shortly after Sandy hit, which I think was probably good timing because a lot of those lesson learned could be incorporated into the new plan. We had our state hazard mitigation team, or the Schmidt as they call them. We're definitely lots of funny acronyms, but they were definitely a key team member of ours that we worked with right from the beginning, both in developing strategies for using our hazard mitigation grant program funds, but also more broadly for some of the other funding streams, and a lot of those concepts, whether it be Blue Acre buyout programs and things like that, came out of our plan. But I think sort of going along with what Diane said, the plan, the state had never experienced anything like Sandy before, so the plan is only as helpful as it can be sort of a starting point in terms of figuring out how to tackle. But there's so many sort of intricacies and nuances that you need to address based on the actual circumstances of the disaster event that, the plan is just, I would say, one component of a much larger, more involved strategy.
And for those of you all who are familiar with Amanda Torres, who I believe is listening in on this call, Amanda has a terrific presentation about how the city had been doing all the steps that it took to prepare for this kind of disaster, although, it isn't something that can necessarily be anticipated in this magnitude, that there were tons of steps that were being taken by the community already in the lead up. And because those preparations had been made, it did put Rockport further ahead on the recovery process. So if you're interested, Amanda's not busy at all. She's the only planner in the city of Rockport, so I'm sure she'd be really happy to talk with you at length about it. But yeah, I think the city was very well prepared, particularly for a community of its size, based on who it had at the helm.
So the city had a current hazard mitigation plan. They had updated the version of the IBC, International Building Code, that they were using. They'd adopted a new freeboarding requirement, and so when businesses came in and said, we need permits, they were prepared to issue them consistent with all of these new standards because the standards were already in place and people were familiar with them. And Amanda's, and I'm sure it was a team, but led by Amanda, they were able to require compliance in most cases from people who said, what do you mean I can't do what I did before? And well, because the rules have changed and we want everybody to be safer. And that was pretty advanced thinking for a city the size of Rockport, and they're to be commended for that.
Did we lose Kimberly?
Oh, I went on mute. Sorry about that.
I figured.
Yes. Did you hear the beginning of what I was saying?
No.
We didn't hear anything. No.
Oh, okay. So what I was saying is that we just have a few minutes, and I don't want to keep people too long, but I have two questions, and I'm going to pose both of them and let you all pick the one that you would prefer to answer. The first question is, what patterns have your communities instituted in land use and where development goes and what kind of development is where as a result of the storms you've experienced? So that's question number one you can pick. And question number two of your choosing is, if you had an ideal level of staffing, what would you have done differently after the storm hit your communities?
This is Terry. I'm happy to kick us off. I think I'll take the first question. One thing that's interesting about New Jersey is, even though it was a sort of state-led recovery program, New Jersey is what you consider a home rule state, which means that the state doesn't have much say in local land use and zoning decisions. But that being said, we sort of looked at the tools in our arsenal to make sure that steps were being taken to make sure that the rebuilding was done with hazard mitigation and resiliency in mind. So we did a number of things along those lines. First, about a month after the storm, FEMA came out with advisory base flood elevation maps. Many of our flood maps had not been redone in in some instances in decades. And so we wanted to make sure that, and FEMA wanted to make sure that we weren't using, really outdated information in terms of making rebuilding decisions. And so, we basically kicked the tires on those, we call them ABFEs, and quickly adopted them as the new building standard. We were assured that they were very conservative in the sense that the final flood maps should not require any higher elevations than what's in those flood maps. So we figured we need to be conservative. So we adopted those and also required 1 foot of freeboard, for all building. The second thing we did was we made sure that the state adopted the latest construction code to make sure that, and the state is generally pretty good at adopting the international building codes as they come out. So, but that was something that was prioritized to make sure that the latest and greatest in building techniques was utilized. The third, for infrastructure projects, we required that all infrastructure projects not only meet those ABFE standards with freeboard, but also factor in the NOAA sea level rise maps to make sure that they're not just building to the lowest possible standards, but that they're actually taking even additional steps and utilizing federal funding to do that. Finally, this kind of goes along with the home rule comment I made before. We felt like we couldn't force people to leave their homes or their communities, but we did fund a robust Blue Acres program, which sought to acquire large swaths of properties in the most flood-prone communities through a voluntary buyout program. And after the properties were acquired, the structures were demolished and the properties maintained as open space, and sort of served as a natural flood barrier, or at least absorbed some of the floodwaters in future storm events.
And I'll have a question too. In terms of additional staff, in a dream world, what would have been perfect for you if you had additional staff? Well, our chamber office has a staff of 6, so you can imagine an assistant for each of those 6 people would have been awesome. In terms of public information, we've already identified a plan of 12 different positions. You need a videographer, you need several people data mining, you have different types of social media platform monitors that you need whatever communication at that time period, you need a person monitoring that, and then of course you need a press release mechanism, and then somebody on foot. So I've identified 12 additional positions there. And then I think our community was at extreme loss without an EDC, Economic Corporation. And so a person there and assistant, it was tremendous for us to be at loss for that. Our city has 4 MBAs on staff, and they did a tremendous job with what they had, but can you imagine if they had more of what they could have done? So I feel like at least 20 to 25 in major important areas of the disaster.
This is Carol. The issue of additional staffing around communication, I think, is a really helpful point to make. If you're in a place where a lot of the work that gets done is driven by volunteers and donations, somebody has to start tracking that on day one, or else you never really know the magnitude of the investment required to bring your communities back, and yet everyone's too busy to be able to think about that, at least at the beginning. The staffing that I think the city needs 2 years out, if I could wave a magic wand, is to strengthen the resources that Amanda has. There was a great slide that Diane showed of all these major projects that are coming. I think it would be helpful if the city had professional staff who've negotiated those kinds of big projects in the past, and they know the economics of it, so that they're in a better position to develop what is a term sheet for what the city expects and what the city needs to expect that the applicant is going to ask for. So that would be 2 years out. What I think is the most significant additional staffing that I would recommend. And, you know, if it were right after the storm, I'd go volunteer to work for Diane, because I'm just so impressed with what the Chamber accomplished.
Oh, we need you. Please come.
Don't wait for another storm, right?
Right.
Don't say that.
All right. Are there any sort of closing thoughts or observations that you all would like to share with our listeners as we wrap for today?
Nothing for me. I think we covered a lot of ground.
I'm good as well. Thank you guys for asking me to participate.
And what I wanted to let everybody know, so we've gotten quite a few questions on the webinar about the availability of this program afterwards. Thanks to the North Central Texas Council of Governments, we are recording this program and the presentation. And when they are prepared and complete, they'll be available on the web at the texasplanning.org website. But we will we'll publicize that broadly through our networks to make sure that it's available. It will be eligible also if you are an urban planner listening to this for continuing education credits for your AICP maintenance. And so we want to encourage you to encourage your friends and neighbors to listen to this conversation as well. I think I've learned a lot from the last hour and a half, and I hope that those participating in the program have too. So many thanks to the three of you. Many thanks to all the folks who helped put this program together for the Texas chapter of the APA. And I want to encourage all of you who are working in the area of disaster recovery and planning to mitigate for future disasters and to become more resilient, to keep dialogues like this going, and to reach out to those peers who can help you grow the planning network that will make your community more resilient to future disasters. So with that, thank you to everyone, and we look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Everybody have a good weekend.
You too.